concerns is that, I mean, there are opponents who demonize drones, and then you have the proponents who glorify drones and argue that, you know, it's a low or no cost way to eliminate terrorists, eliminate the bad guys, regardless of where they may be. But we hope that today's panel will address some of these concerns and provide you with some recommendations as to what role you can play in educating your boss on this issue. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce our first speaker. Professor Noreen Shah serves as the Associate Director of the Counterterrorism and Human Rights Project at Columbia Law School. She serves as a consultant to Amnesty International. Professor Shah develops research and advocacy on human rights and counterterrorism policy, including covert drone strikes, terrorism investigations, and prosecution of American Muslims and safeguards against torture and renditions. Since joining the Human Rights Institute in 2009, Professor Shah has co-authored major reports on drone strikes, such as the civilian impact of drones, counting drone strike deaths and targeting with drone technology, humanitarian law implications. Professor Shah's remarks will focus on the civilian impact and casualties of targeted killings.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I don't think this is on, but thanks so much for having me. So I should start just by saying that I'll be speaking in my personal capacity, and my views don't represent anyone's but my own, which is not surprising. So the interesting thing about drone technology is, as you say, that it's demonized, and it's also talked about as a panacea or a way forward, away from the kinds of murky, bloody, costly counterinsurgencies of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's incredibly tempting technology because it is, in fact, so precise in its capabilities. Now, today I just want to lay out a few reasons why we should be cautious about that temptation, and what things we should be doing going forward to make sure that that temptation doesn't obscure the need to do the same kinds of things that the United States government, that the U.S. military does whenever it uses force, to safeguard civilians in the area, and to make sure that the force that we use is exercised in a credible and legitimate way that is seen as credible and legitimate around the world. So drone technology provides a temptation to go to war often and unofficially because it is more precise, and it means that we don't put our own troops in harm's way, as everyone knows. And at last week's hearing, General Cartwright set out some of the reasons why this technology is so powerful in the sense of enabling us to know who exactly we're killing. The problem is that mistakes get made. And as General Cartwright said in his written testimony, whether something is precise doesn't just depend on how good the technology is, but how good the underlying intelligence is and how good the underlying intelligence analysis is. And I like to put it as, whether you're driving a Honda Civic or a BMW, it doesn't matter how great the car is, if you don't know how to drive, or if you don't know where you're going, you're still possibly going to crash. So we can laud this technology, and we should laud it. It is not a nuclear bomb. It is inherently more discriminate, or it has that potential to be more discriminate. But problems can still occur, especially when we use drone technology outside of traditional armed conflict theaters, where we have fewer boots on the ground and we have less resources to help us corroborate the video surveillance that we're getting. So there's two things going forward once we do recognize, and I'll give you some reasons why I think we should be a little bit more cautious about using drone technology, but the two things going forward that we should be doing if we're going to be using drone technology are, first, making sure that there are systems to investigate and respond to civilian harm from drone strikes. We have those systems in Afghanistan, and we've built them up over time in response to public pressure and important scrutiny. And those systems that the Department of Defense has established for its operations in active combat theaters and a hot battlefield should apply just the same outside of the hot battlefield. It's important to recognize and dignify and investigate civilian harm, to give dignity to the families and to the people living in places where drone strikes occur. And more than that, it sends a signal to the people who are living in that area and to people around the world that the U.S. takes seriously its responsibilities when it uses force. The second thing that we should do, and I'll go more into this, is engage on why we're using drone technology. Why are we using lethal force? Should we be expanding our use of lethal force to new areas and against new groups. It seems to me that the more we expand the fronts of the war on terrorism, the less we talk about that expansion. And that's a very perverse outcome of this use of drone technology. So let me give you a couple of reasons why we should be cautious about the use of drone technology. And the most compelling of those reasons I'll leave to Farea, who can speak firsthand about experiences with mistakes made with the use of drone technology. But even if drones are as precise as we hear they are, even if the Obama administration has course corrected, which it says it has, after it's committed major mistakes, why should we still be cautious about using drone technology? Why should we be cautious about drones becoming the weapon of choice or the American standard? The first reason is that drones are inherently life-threatening. When the main weapon in a form of warfare is drones, when we don't have boots on the ground and we don't have a practice of trying to capture people, we just use drones, and drones don't provide any method of capture. So there's no opportunity to surrender, in a sense, when a drone is flying overhead. If there's no opportunity to surrender, there's no opportunity after the fact to investigate who the person was who was being targeted, whether or not they were a suspect who truly was a person who posed a threat to the United States, an imminent threat. In other conflicts, we would try to capture these individuals, interrogate them. I would certainly argue that there have been abuses that occurred when we've done that in past conflicts, but there's a way to do it in the correct way. And capturing individuals and detaining them can be done in a rights-respecting way. Drones don't have to take away that option, but in fact what we hear more and more of in reports about the use of drones in Yemen and Pakistan is that in fact we aren't capturing people, and drones mean that our policy in those countries, our practices in those countries are inherently about killing people. So drones are inherently more life-threatening than alternative counterterrorism measures, and so we should be cautious about that. The second reason is the political effects of using drone technology. So when we've used drone technology in Pakistan, for instance, and most notably, we've done it in a way where we rely on the secret consent of that government, or the lack of actual consent of that government, depending upon who you ask. But in doing so, we risk delegitimizing the Pakistani government in the eyes of its own people. Now, why should we care about that? I would argue that we should be planning for 15 to 20 years down the road and asking what kind of Pakistani government we want to be working with 15 to 20 years down the road. So I think most people in this room know that drone strikes are incredibly unpopular in Pakistan, that the Pakistani parliament has passed successive resolutions condemning drone strikes. If you are a Pakistani citizen living in that country and you have voiced your opinion and your representatives have voiced their opinion against drone strikes and they continue to occur, what kind of faith can you have in your own government? If we're not building a policy, if we don't have a policy that builds faith in the Pakistani civilian government and that actively undermines democratic impulses in that country, then in Pakistan in particular, we're helping elements that are averse to the civilian government, averse to democracy, and we should be cautious about that. We should be cautious about that in a country that for more than half of its lifetime has been run by a military that hasn't been accountable to its own people. And if that is a military that has taken a lot of money from the United States and also acted in ways that were not fully cooperative with the United States, we should be asking whether our policy, which undermines the civilian government and essentially helps the military, is actually helpful for U.S. interests down the line, even if it is something that it seems expedient at this time. That's very specific to Pakistan, but generally when we use drone technology to conduct drone strikes secretly with the secret consent of governments, we're asking them to wink and to nod as we do it. And the long-term political effects in that country are to skew debate within the country about who the United States is and what it's doing there. And it squelches the normal democratic process in those countries. So we should be cautious about the political effects of our policies. Although drone strikes seem expedient, they seem the best way to move forward, we have to think about 15 to 20 years down the line. What does this policy and this practice mean for what happens to this country that we're doing drone strikes in? And what kind of countries we want to be dealing with in 15 to 20 years? The third thing we should be cautious about is that although drone strikes are precise in terms of the technological capability, and there certainly would seem to provide a better way than sending in a bunch of ground troops, or having, for instance, in Pakistan, sending in Pakistani ground troops they increase violence and instability in the areas where drone strikes occur. So in Pakistan, for instance, and I'm speaking about Pakistan because I know Farea will be able to speak a lot more in depth about Yemen, militant groups have retaliated against local villagers in the communities where drone strikes have occurred because they believe those local villagers are acting as spies for the CIA. And we've heard reports repeatedly about people being tortured and killed by militant groups because they were believed to be spies for the CIA. Now, the responsibility, of course, for those human rights abuses lays with those militant groups. But we should know that the idea of a surgical strike, going in, taking out one bad guy, and leaving is too convenient, and it's actually naive. We have lasting political effects to every drone strike that we conduct in that particular area, and there's effects for those civilians living in that area that we should be thinking about. The fourth reason I'll give you why we should be cautious about drone strikes is that they undermine U.S. legitimacy around the world. I don't think it's an understatement to say that drone strikes, whether it's fair or not, have become President Obama's Guantanamo in terms of providing a recruitment tool, a rallying point for anti-U.S. sentiment around the world. And this is in large part because of the secrecy about drone technology. It has become demonized to such a great extent. The U.S. can reverse course on that. And there are things that the United States government should be doing to set the record straight about what its drone strikes policy is, but also to constrain that drone strikes policy and to make it the case that we don't, as a reflex, as a knee-jerk reaction, turn to this technology when we see a new threat or a new emerging group that could pose a threat to U.S. interests. I outlined them before, and I'll just briefly mention them again, that first of all, we need to make sure that the systems that we have in place in every other kind of armed conflict situations in Iraq and Afghanistan also apply to drone strikes conducted in Pakistan and Yemen. So we've heard proposals recently, and it seems to be underway, that CIA will be having less of a role in drone strikes, and that there'll be a Department of Defense-run program that is the major program. That is welcome news, because there's a lot of problems with the CIA being involved. But it's not a panacea. We have to make sure that Department of Defense directives that would apply to operations generally also apply to the Joint Special Operations Command. So when I talk about investigations and setting up schemes for compensation, that's not something newfangled. That's something that the military already does. And it's a question of making sure that the Department of Defense directives that require law of war compliance and that also require that incidents be reported and promptly investigated and thoroughly investigated, that those also apply to drone strikes. That drone strikes don't, by virtue of the precision quality of the technology, somehow escape the same kinds of demands that we make of the military and other Department of Defense generally. The second thing is, and I think everybody in this room knows this, is that we need to engage on why we're expanding the war on terrorism, why we're expanding use of lethal force. Should we be expanding use of lethal force when we encounter new groups and new threats, or some alternative strategy better? Drone technology is very dangerous in the sense that it seems so costless that we would say, well, why not just use a drone strike to address this new group? I've tried to lay out a couple of reasons why I think there's no such thing as a costless use of lethal force. In terms of how we move forward in debating the expansion of drone warfare and the expansion to new groups, requiring disclosure of what an associated force is and what groups constitute associated forces under the Obama administration's interpretation of the law is critical. There also, though, should be substantive limits that Congress can be thinking about. We've heard the term targeted killing a lot to describe this issue, but more than 4,000 people have been killed. So we know that the scale of killings is not really targeted in that sense. There are more than 4,000 people being killed. And Congress can respond by focusing on the government's limitations that it says exist and querying whether those limits are true, and then asking for more specific limits. So the term imminent threat, we know that the administration, in some of the memos that have been discussed, has defined that word expansively. Imminent threat or imminence could be, interpretation from international law could be drawn, and there could be specific limitations set up on that word so that it can't be radically reinterpreted to mean basically elongated imminence or imminence that is not imminence at all. We should only be countering true imminent threats to the United States, and we shouldn't be countering threats to other countries groups that pose a threat to the other countries or regional, local governments, but who don't currently have grievances towards the United States, because we could be turning those groups against us as well. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to speak with others more. And as has been mentioned, I've done a couple of reports on drone strikes and have very specific recommendations there. I'll also just say that in General Cartwright's written testimony last week, he copied and pasted recommendations from a report that I wrote called The Civilian Impact of Drones. And he said that list of actions has, for the most part, been accomplished, though not everyone knows that. And of course, for me, that's a dream for someone to say that everything that I think should happen has already happened. But I think their major problem is that there's a credibility gap, that the administration might be doing things behind closed doors, but first of all, it hasn't told anyone what those things are. And second of all, we have to take its word for it, and I don't think that we should. There could be a dangerous echo chamber where people are saying we're doing the right policies, we've got it all done, but if there's no outside check, if Congress isn't involved in those debates, then there's no real guarantee that things are getting better, as we have heard that they are. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Shah. Our next speaker is Farea Al-Muslimi. Farea is a speaker, writer, and a freelance journalist from Yemen. He has worked with several local, regional, and international NGOs, including National Democratic Institute, USAID, and Resonate Yemen. While in the 9th grade, Farea was awarded a scholarship from the Department of State to study English for 1 year at AUMF, the American English Center in Yemen. He was later awarded a State Department scholarship to the Youth and Exchange Study Program, which aims to promote peace and understanding between Americans and youth in predominantly Muslim countries. At the age of 17, Farea was elected chairman of the Supporting Democracy Committee in the Yemeni Youth Consultative Council. Without further ado, Farea.
Thank you very much. You make it almost very hard to say anything smart anymore. Especially I have been the last week repetitive as I have never been in my life, which is, I hope you shall still say something new. But let me just start by saying something I don't think I have said enough. Drones are not Yemen's biggest problem, not even one of the big issues in Yemen. I have 10 million Yemenis go to bed starving every night. There is a horrible economy, very horrible political transition that is happening in the country. But I do think, or at least I have seen, that drones cause strategic problems in Yemen, more threat than the current ones. I don't understand a lot of the procedures and what does that mean in DC, what does it mean, and the names and the terminology and the remote and non-remote, but I have seen it in the ground not working. I always hear that this is targeting uncaptured people, and this is targeting threatening members of Al-Qaeda. I have seen that as probably the biggest lie in the ground, to claim that the targeting is for people who are not possibly captured. I have seen massive majority of those who are targeted are people who could easily have been captured. The last one in my village, which I think is an interesting case, is someone. It's harder probably to capture someone in the hell here in this Congress than to capture that person. And that's for many reasons. One is the village is very well-known, peaceful place. Farmers themselves would have captured this man if someone told them he's a bad person. But the issue what has happened, I think, and that's how it's security-wise more harming to target, is you have killed this man. No one ever knew that he was a bad man. He was in the morning a public figure, solving problems in the place where the government does not solve the problems or care. And at night, he was probably hidingly being with AQAB, with Al-Qaeda. So what happened is you killed him, and you didn't even explain to people why you killed this man. You killed their problem solver, not the militant. And two, that this man had probably planted some people in the village. But you didn't capture him or ask people at least to talk to him before it and investigate and see who is behind them. So security-wise, you have made more threat. You could have, if you captured him, which has been probably easier than planning to target him, made at least locals, investigate and question him before you captured him, and then they will set him away. That raises another threat, I think, and another critical issue I have personally seen, is I never knew this man was a target, and no one ever knew. And what does that mean is probably I'm back in the village tomorrow, hugging my 7th grade teacher, and suddenly he's a target. If you leak the names, I would have at least stayed away from these people. I would have captured them. I'd have, as happened 4 months ago in the village, people knew, so they were suspicious of 3 people, not even the government, the farmers themselves, the illiterate, poor, miserable farmers. They captured these 3 people and they took them to the government. They said, we're suspicious of these people. And then the government actually found that these are AQAP members. But you don't announce the names. I don't know who's next. And I don't know whom to say hi and whom not to say hi to. That's probably the biggest fear you can ever have in your life. And then you always say drones are better than the ground forces, and I think that is one of the biggest misleading statements I've ever heard in my life. There is no ground forces to say that didn't work. The United States of America has trained a very well counterterrorism unit in Yemen, the most elite unit in the country. That unit, unfortunately, for the last 2 or 3 years, has been shooting at democracy protesters in the capital. And not a single soldier of this counterterrorism unit was sent to capture anyone else. You didn't even try, even regular soldiers, not the counterterrorism unit, to capture these people. So the 2 bases I have seen are, doesn't make any sense in the ground. And as someone, and people does not understand that exactly easily. If you sent me an email without a title, you don't need a title, saying, hey, this man in your village is a bad guy, I would have picked up the phone, called farmers and said, hey, who's this guy? Capture him and bring him to the capital or whatever. That would have easily happened. And instead, this is an area, and I have seen that tens of other places in Yemen, where people, there is no hospital, there is no college, miserably poor, and very cooperative in every sense, more than the government. There is more, the place is more modern to make it the capital of Yemen than the capital itself. That's how peaceful it is. But instead, you terrified them, and you came from the sky, and you shot, and you made every wrong thing that you should never do. There is a psychological aspect into this. I spoke to a man from the middle areas of Yemen, Rada, and I've said this a lot, but I find it fascinating what he says. He says that women in his village used to tell their kids, go to bed or I will call your father. Now they say, go to bed or I will call the planes. You have changed the local domestic culture. It's terrifying in the sense, if there is ground forces, I will sleep. I know that there is someone there outside. But I don't know who's next. Imagine I'm walking in the morning, making my coffee and taking care of my goats and so on, and suddenly something comes and bumps. Maybe there is a target, maybe not. But you didn't even tell me there is someone. You didn't try it, you didn't ask me. And it's a psychological fear, but it's also a security threat. In the sense you have made people realize the threat above their head, and you distracted them from their enemy, Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda has used that distraction that is happening here, forgetting that, the drones are here because Al-Qaeda are made here, not vice versa. But what has happened actually is the opposite. It has used, so far for the last few years, I have seen it solving some tactical issues, creating huge strategic issues, security-wise and political-wise and society-wise. It has been used for local domestic purposes also, political maneuvering. I'm aware of some cases where local politicians were set up by other competitors of them and give false information to be targeted, whether by US drone or by a Yemeni plane under the order of the United States in Yemen. But both it has been used for political domestic struggles. I don't know if I can speak more about this, but we have always said that is one of the biggest sins the United States is committing in Yemen on its national security. Look, since the drones started AQAB is more powerful than it ever was. And even when you target and kill some militants, you're exactly using the same policy McNamara did in Vietnam of counting the dead bodies and forgetting the new ones you're creating. Al-Qaeda power in Yemen was never, ever based on how many members it has and it doesn't have, but rather on the logic it's creating, it creates for it on the ground. And when you use the drones, you're helping their logic of claiming that the United States is in a war with Yemenis. And that's, so you have fought the war by their own rules of the game. When you kill a KAB member, he wants heaven, 72 versions and whatever, and you're giving him that. But you're establishing for the ground that he's claiming or he's asking or he has told locals about. And that's, I think, a huge issue that is not by any way realized. I've spoken that if this needs to be solved, you need to pay compensation for locals, those who lost their civilians. The problem is you didn't just kill civilians sometimes, but you killed people who, their father was the person who brings the food into the table, and they don't have food anymore because of that. You should issue an apology, and you should stop this, and you should announce the names already on your list. This has not been working, security-wise, politically-wise. It's being used, even if you look to it locally in Yemen, it has been used for a political maneuvering between Iran and the United States in Yemen. So you speak of the parliament that have said it in Pakistan. In Yemen, the parliament hasn't said anything, or the president actually has endorsed it publicly in DC. But that makes him look, you know, the puppet Pervez Musharraf of America in Yemen. And that is something that has been highly used by Iran and its groups to hinder the transition and to discredit President Hadi. And on papers and on the ground, they have every logic. And if you look to it today, they have a spirit more than any other political group in the country. I think, yeah, that's all I have to say, or more accurately, re-say. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your perspective, and we'll have more time to see questions during the Q&A for sure. Our final speaker is Professor Jennifer Daskal. She's an adjunct professor of law and fellow at the Center on Law and National Security at Georgetown University Law Center. From 2009 to 2011, Professor Daskal served as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice. During her time there, she served on the Joint Attorney General and Secretary of Defense-led Detention Policy Task Force and provided legal advice on a range of national security matters, including issues related to detention, surveillance, and interrogation practice. And prior to joining the DOJ, she worked as Senior Counterterrorism Counsel at Human Rights Watch, where she served as the organization's spokesperson on U.S. counterterrorism policy. Professor Daskal will speak about the legal framework underpinning the administration's drone policy.
Great, thank you. Thanks for organizing this, and thanks to all of you for coming. I am going to shift topics a little bit and talk about the legal architecture that undergirds the use of drones and targeted killing more generally, specifically the 2001 authorization to use military force, and talk a little bit about the ongoing debate about its arguable obsolescence and needs for reform. So, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, the AUMF was passed just 4 days after September 11th, and it authorized, and I think this is important because it often gets lost in the debate, the actual language of the AUMF, it authorized the use of all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons that the President determined planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th. Now, notably, Congress, right after the September 11th attacks, rejected a much broader proposal that was put forth by the Bush administration at that time to authorize the broad-scale use of force to, quote, deter and preempt any future acts of terrorism or aggression against the United States. Instead, Congress, just 4 days after the September 11th attacks, explicitly tied the force authorization to those linked to September 11th, namely Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The past two administrations, supported by Congress, have also interpreted the authorization to also cover what are so-called associated forces, which is an issue I will return to in a minute. Now, according to what can be gleaned from high-level administration statements on this issue, the AUMF provides the legal basis for almost all, if not all, of the strikes, the drone strikes that have taken place to date in both Pakistan and Yemen since 2002. So where are we now? It's been 12 years. The Taliban has long been removed from power, and according to statements from the president and from Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, the Director of National Intelligence, Dennis Clapper, Al-Qaeda core is largely decimated. Dennis Clapper just last month told Congress that Al-Qaeda is probably, quote, unable to carry out complex large-scale attacks on the West at this point. So with the groups primarily responsible for 9/11 largely degraded, and the United States prepared to withdraw most of its troops from Afghanistan by the end of 2014, the specific conflict that was authorized by the AUMF in 2001 appears to be nearing an end. This, in my view, ought to be the cause for celebration. As former General Counsel Jay Johnson eloquently stated at the end of last year, and here I'm quoting from him, "War must be regarded as a finite, extraordinary, and unnatural state of affairs. In its 12th year, we must not accept the current conflict and all that it entails as the new normal. Peace must be regarded as the norm toward which the human race continually strives." Instead, however, we have seen two trends. First, we've seen a possible, although not yet confirmed, push by at least some in the administration to extend the AUMF to cover new groups, what some have labeled extra AUMF threats. And second, partially in response to this possibility, we've also seen a push by some academics and some members of Congress for a broader, expansive AUMF, one that would essentially delegate to the executive branch the authority to designate new groups with which the United States is at war, groups that do not have any ostensible connection to 9/11. So I'm going to describe both approaches in a bit more detail and end by what I suggest is a much more sensible approach going forward, one that sunsets the AUMF in connection with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and shifts counterterrorism policy much more in line with our allies, with military force, including the use of drones, a last resort, not a first resort. So as I've already stated, the AUMF did not name any specific groups, but has been interpreted to cover the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and associated forces. And in fact, with Al-Qaeda core largely degraded, most targeted killing operations appear to be directed at these so-called associated forces. There has, however, been a shocking lack of clarity and transparency as to which groups qualify as associated forces. In testimony last year, former Department of Defense General Counsel provided the only official definition of associated forces to date. He described an associated force as having two characteristics. It's a group, an organized armed group that has entered the conflict alongside Al-Qaeda, and it's a co-belligerent with Al-Qaeda in the hostilities against the United States and its coalition partners. Now, under this definition, a group of two or more unaffiliated terrorists, like the Boston Marathon bombers, clearly do not qualify, nor does an entity that merely shares an ideological affinity with Al-Qaeda. But it's not exactly clear who does qualify. And here I want to emphasize that this notion of associated forces is based on a concept of co-belligerency that derives from neutrality rules that were developed in international armed conflict. And under neutrality law applicable in international armed conflict, states who enter the fight alongside another state party violates its obligation of neutrality. A perceived violation of neutrality is generally deemed to require the opposing state to provide notice to the state that we think you violated your duty of neutrality and you have an opportunity to retain your neutral status, or we are going to consider you a party to the conflict and within our right to attack you and your armed forces. In such a situation, there's no secrecy as to who the enemy is, who qualifies as the co-belligerent of the warring state. Here, in this conflict, however, there is no public notice or no acknowledgement of the groups against which the United States deems itself in a conflict. We know from court filings in the Anwar al-Awlaki case that the administration deems Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula operating in Yemen to be either part of or associated with Al-Qaeda. But what about other groups? We just don't know. There's been some reporting that there's been discussion about adding groups like Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb that's operating in Mali, or the Al-Nusra Front in Syria, to deem these groups as covered by this associated force. There's no indication that this has actually happened yet. But there is a relatively widespread agreement, which I agree with, that it's a non-satisfactory state of affairs for the United States to not be clear about which groups it is engaged in an armed conflict. So one of my recommendations for you is for Congress to push for public disclosure of which groups qualify as associated forces. Now, I've already said that there has, in part due to these concerns about the AUMF being expanded, being stretched beyond its original intent, beyond its original language, there's a push among some academics and reportedly some members of Congress for a new AUMF, one that essentially either mirrors the previously rejected Bush administration proposal and declares an effective war against international terrorism, or a presumptively more moderate, but in my view equally disturbing, proposal to delegate to the executive branch the relatively open-ended authority to designate new groups with which the United States is in an armed conflict without requiring any nexus to September 11th. Now, the underlying assumption seems to be that the expansion, not the curtailment, of military response to terrorism, including the use of drones, and the associated detention without charge, is required to keep the nation safe. I think that this underlying assumption should be rejected for at least 4 reasons. First, it's not clear at this point that any emerging terrorist threat poses the type of threat to the United States that justifies a congressional authorization of military force or the application of law of war tools. In the recently released Intelligence Community Worldwide Threat Assessment, only AQAP is described as having the intent and capacity to launch attacks on the U.S. homeland. If and when the AUMF sunsets, nothing would stop Congress from declaring a narrow and specific AQAP authorization to use force based on a public debate and a determination that AQAP is an organized group that presents the type of sustained, significant threat justifying the declaration of an armed conflict. Second, contrary to the claims otherwise, law enforcement tools are and have proven to be extremely effective in dealing with most terrorist threats. Over the past decade, our federal courts have prosecuted approximately 500 terrorists, according to the Department of Justice statistics, including over 60 terrorists who were captured overseas. Our counterterrorism capacity has increased significantly over the past decade. The foreign intelligence surveillance, the wall separating intelligence, surveillance, and law enforcement has come down, leading to much more effective law enforcement. Our substantive criminal laws have evolved significantly to cover a much wider array of terrorism acts, including the extraterritorial application of material support statutes. The public safety exception to Miranda has been accepted by district courts as applying at least in limited circumstances, and an increasing cohort of judges and civilian prosecutors has successfully navigated with handling of classified information. Meanwhile, we have prosecuted, as I've already said, close to 500 international terrorists, often leading to sentences of multiple decades or life. And key allies have prosecuted and convicted numerous others. Third, for the reasons that we've already heard stated quite eloquently, an open-ended declaration of armed conflict actually runs the risk of undermining the United States' principal counterterrorism goals, namely the goal of protecting this and future generations of Americans from the threat of international terrorism. This is so for the many reasons that we have heard about, including the most obvious are the risks of blowback, international approbation and reduced international counterterrorism cooperation, which is essential for our national security, and stronger claims on the part of other actors to use the same authorities in ways that rightly make us nervous. Think, for example, about a Russia or a China with a legal authority to use lethal force as a matter of first resort against any member of a group that it deems falls within a broad definition of terrorism. Fourth and finally, were additional groups to pose the type of significant and strategic threat that the criminal law could not adequately address? At this point, Congress and the executive both have the tools to act. Article 2 self-defense authorities provide the president with the authority to take immediate and, where necessary, lethal action with respect to a member or leader of any other splinter terrorist group that poses an immediate, an imminent, and significant threat that cannot feasibly be addressed through other means. And just as it did quickly after September 11th, Congress could always pass a new authorization to use military force tied specifically to the threat posed by that group. Thus, it's my view that any actual threat can and should be appropriately dealt with at the time that it emerges, without resorting to what amounts to an open-ended extension of armed conflict and the corresponding authority to use force as a matter of first resort. So very briefly, what I suggest is that with the drawdown of forces in Afghanistan and the discussion of Al-Qaeda core being largely decimated, we ought to be having a discussion about the end of the conflict and a shift away from the war. I support and I encourage Congress to consider a sunsetting of the AUMF tied to the withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan. If enacted in the short term, this would give the administration more than sufficient time to ascertain what, if any, gap in authorities would result, and Congress time to respond, either by declaring a group-specific AUMF or enacting other targeted and appropriate measures to deal with specific threats. Critically, I think it's time for the U.S. to shift its approach to rely first and foremost on law enforcement authorities and counterterrorism cooperation as a means of dealing with the threat, with the knowledge and expectation that the President can and should, in appropriate circumstances, exercise his self-defense authorities if and when an actual and imminent threat cannot be dealt with through other means. This approach moves the United States much more in line with its key allies, ultimately inures to its counterterrorism benefit for the reasons that have been eloquently described earlier, and sets an example that we can demand others follow, and to do so with pride. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Daskell. So we're going to go into Q&A, and we'll give plenty of time to ask our distinguished panelists questions. But I did want to pose the first question to Professor Shaw regarding civilian and civilian casualties of the administration's drone program. I mean, as you eloquently explained in your remarks, and we also heard this during last week's hearing by Peter Bergen, the administration has drastically expanded the drones program. Specifically, I believe that from an average of one strike every 40 days, it went to every 4 days by mid-2011. And the number of strikes that the administration has administered is 6 times the number that President Bush did in both his terms. And since you explained the devastating impact that these strikes have on civilians' casualties, I mean, why is it that it's been expanded, and why is it that we're not taking the proper precautions, safeguards to ensure that civilian life is protected?
I mean, the precise problem is that we don't know why they've been expanded. Or perhaps some people's bosses in this room know why, and have specific reasons. I think it's very possible that, the number of groups that pose a threat to someone's interest, to Pakistan's interests, or to the people who live in those particular areas, to their interest or to U.S. interests, has increased. We've heard that the core of Al-Qaeda has been decimated, but we know that there's other militant groups in West Pakistan that are incredibly violent. The question is, what is the actual impact of drone strikes in ending those groups, or even just disrupting those groups? And there has to be debate about whether drone strikes, although they've killed, we know that they've killed some Al-Qaeda leaders and some leaders of those groups. We know they've killed foot soldiers of those groups. And I'm not here to tell you that those groups aren't bad and that some of those people aren't, truly posing threats to people in those areas. But I question whether or not it's effective at actually stopping violence in those places. And one of the reasons is, for instance, in Pakistan, U.S. Institute of Peace released this study a couple of months ago showing that the Pakistani Taliban and other militant groups, because of drone strikes in northwest Pakistan, have shifted to urban centers. They shifted to Karachi, a city of 18 million that's basically the heartland of the economy in Pakistan. And now they're able to conduct crippling terrorist attacks from within Karachi, where drone strikes can't get them because drones can't fire directly into a city. A lot of other people would die. So drone strikes have been effective in a sense, pushing those groups to another part of Pakistan, but incredibly ineffective if you think about the security of that country, because now they have another safe haven that is the economic powerhouse of the country. And if you destabilize the major cities of that country, then that country will fall apart. I'm not, it is of course horrendous for there to be terrorist attacks or extremist attacks in the northwest part of Pakistan, but if your policy ends up shifting groups or pushing groups to Islamabad and to Karachi, then that country will collapse, and of course that's not only horrible for the people who live there, it's really bad for U.S. interests as well. So, why are drone strikes expanding? Why is there this acceleration? I think there's some intuitive reasons why that we can guess at, and I've guessed at them, that there are more groups that pose a threat, there are more people in those groups. But the real question is are drone strikes the way to answer that threat? And then the other question is that a threat that's against the United States, and should it be dealt with by the United States? Or should we be adopting policies that enhance the credibility and legitimacy of those governments? And those governments are the ones that should be dealing with those extremist and militant groups in their own countries.
Thank you, Professor Shaw. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes.
Sure. Jerome Sokolowski from Voice of America. I'm wondering, I guess some of the thinking, behind closed doors and elsewhere is that drone strikes would have a deterrent effect, not just kill targeted people, but persuade people not to join organizations like AQAP because they might be targeted. And I wonder if you have any evidence or observations as to whether that works or not.
That's to me. Sure. I don't think that's true. I have spoken to people who joined AQAP because of the strike drones. That still, I have seen in DC, the conversation is, does this lead to recruitment or not? The whole conversation is shaped right now, as I see it here, is, the whole argument and counter-argument is drones leads AQAP to recruit, and some journalists say, and some security say, no, it doesn't. One, it does. I have seen that personally. Two, that's not the problem. AQAP power, as I said earlier, is never based on how many numbers it has, or determination. So in Marib, very well-known tribal area in Yemen, there was a man who was killed and he has 28 kids, 28 boys, and he could have been easily captured. His oldest, according to my information, is right now already with Qaeda, revenging for his father. The other 28, the other 27, one of them actually the youngest one, 8 years old, he carries an American photo of an American plane in his pocket, and he says, "I want to revenge for my father." I have seen examples of AQAP also trying to recruit people. Some succeeded, some no. It's to say that this is determination is like saying, well, we're gonna make a big umbrella that will cover the whole DC so no water goes into the street. It's impossible. We haven't seen that. If since you started the drone program, AQAP is stronger than it ever was, that doesn't take a rocket scientist to say, well, that's not actually the solution. It's not working. In fact, this has, in a way, this has narrowed down the thinking of the Qaeda problem in a very militaristic, simple, superficial way, I think. Qaeda would love to make the battle between the US and them, and between Yemenis and them, as purely military. That's what they want. Because that's what they're best at, because they're not a government, and that's the least thing they care about. But instead, if you want to win this war, you have to make it a whole comprehensive approach where it's social, ideological, developmental, and that's where you should focus, in my opinion. So, in fact, I don't think so. Some people have fled their houses and they have nothing to do because they're afraid of drones. And AQIB gives a lot of shuttles. In fact, it's totally the opposite.
Can I just add something? I think it's really dangerous to view these countries and the people who live in these countries as either terrorists or would-be terrorists. The fact is that for most of the people living in these countries, especially in the places where drone strikes are occurring, they are the victims of terrorism and of conflict-related violence. We think about terrorism in this country as a threat, and once in a while it's a horrific reality, like in Boston. For people living in Pakistan, it's a reality every other week, right? About 600 terrorist attacks in that country every year for the past 3 years. So the people who are living in these areas, in these countries, are caught between drone strikes and militant groups, and they face that threat. So your average person, I don't think, is on the verge of being radicalized, as though everybody has it inside them. They're like a inherent tendency towards violence. I think we tend to treat people in other countries that way, and it's really. I'm not saying that you're doing that. I'm just saying that's part of the rhetoric, and I think it's really dangerous. And I think it would be better for us to just think of these countries as places where terrorism exists in the country, and people living in that country have an even greater stake than we do in the security of that country, and whether drone strikes in any way are actually helping build the security of the country. And it's the intuitive thought is, yes, we're taking out the bad guys. It should make things better. But as Farea is saying, there is absolutely no proof that drone strikes are effective. And there's a great book called How Terrorism Ends that I would just recommend to everybody as an analysis of when terrorism does actually end and how.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Lydia Benjamin with Code Pink. I have a question for you, Noreen. You seem to be saying in your that the military has more checks and balances, and the military in the drone strikes in Afghanistan had originally put up the number of missiles launched in drone strikes in Afghanistan, and then suddenly just cleared it from its site, and also has never given publicly the number of civilian casualties as a result of those drones. So why and what makes us think then the military would use this in a more transparent way?
Yeah, I've written a lot about this, and it is important that I not let it be misinterpreted or clarified. It's a mistake to think that if we make this a DoD program and get the CIA out of drone strikes, that all of a sudden there won't be problems in terms of transparency. And if the Department of Defense takes the helm and Joint Special Operations Command is running drone strikes, there's a real problem because we know even less about Joint Special Operations Command than we do about the CIA. And there's even less oversight practices and structures. That's debatable, but we do know that the CIA does report on strikes to Congress compared to Joint Special Operations Command. That maybe they're as a matter of policy they're doing that, but there hasn't been the same kind of requirement that they do that. So I think we should be really cautious about it. When I say that conventional military forces over time in response to public pressure have responded and provided some information, I'm talking about at a macro level, that the military has had to do that. Since the 1970s, it's built up an ethos of law of war compliance because it has had to, because it has been in the public spotlight. The problem with the CIA and Joint Special Operations Command is, one, that they're incredibly secretive, but two, to the extent the public knows about them, they're seen just as heroes, and they don't have there's not the same imperative of questioning them, despite practices of abuse. We know, for instance, Joint Special Operations Command committed torture and abuses in Iraq. We should be demanding of them a high degree of transparency because we know in the past abuses have occurred. So we want to make sure that abuses don't occur in the future.
Thank you. I actually have a question for Professor Daskal. So Professor Daskal, in your remarks, you eloquently pointed out the expansive interpretation of AUMF by the administration. And And my question is, for instance, with respect to al-Shabaab in Somalia, how is targeting members of al-Shabaab, a group that has been designated by the State Department as, a state-sponsored group of terrorism, how is that permissible under AUMF when specifically you mentioned that the language in AUMF is restricted in that it only permits the use of force with respect to those who were culpable for 9/11, and also with regard to the purpose and intent for which to use lethal force to prevent future attacks against the U.S. So in that respect, if al-Shabaab is being targeted, then can you say that the administration can effectually expand that to say if, Boko Haram in Nigeria, for instance, is listed as a terrorist group, can they start targeting them as well?
Right. So just to be clear, it's not, I don't think we have any information to suggest one way or another that al-Shabaab is actually deemed an associated force of al-Qaeda at this point. The administration, in order to make that determination, they would have to determine that al-Shabaab, they'd have to essentially determine that al-Shabaab was an organized armed group, which I think they could do, but that it was fighting alongside al-Qaeda as essentially a co-belligerent of al-Qaeda, and that's a harder showing to make. It would be a very hard showing to make with respect to Boko Haram, for example. The question and the concern is that the lack, we can't even talk about this because we don't have transparency in terms of what groups are covered. There are some suggestions that certain al-Shabaab members have been targeted, but again, we don't know if that's because al-Shabaab as an entity is deemed an associated force or if the particular individuals were deemed covered by the AUMF. So there's a lack of transparency that makes having this discussion hard, and I think points to my recommendation to Congress to push for transparency at a minimum in terms of who qualifies as an associated force of al-Qaeda.
Thank you. Any questions?
Ms. Bartaya? I'm sort of curious. I know you've got a lot of exposure here, which is great, with perhaps more progressive elements, progressive liberal groups. I'm curious as to how you feel now. Especially when you, at that first congressional hearing in the Senate, did you feel like you were being listened to? How has the experience been for you? Did you feel like you had an opportunity to penetrate perhaps some of the folks who are more bought into drone use already?
Sure. In one sense, I honestly didn't expect this as 1% of the reaction I got. For one simple reason. We've been talking about this for years, and no one ever paid attention to it. Tens of people have before me wrote about this. Most of my testimony is something I pitched to editors before as articles, and no one even accepted it for free, literally. So I was surprised with that. But I do always gamble on this country, that as a country that respects information, when you bring information and accurate, it is being taken seriously. And my gamble, as always, on the American people. When they see something, I think they say something, as the train says it. And that is one of the things they sell. I think it probably helped think of the conversation from a different point of view, but definitely tomorrow editors will have something new to fill in their pages, and it will be over. Because, security people are not, as I've seen it, even in Yemen or here, are not like journalists. When they make a mistake, they say, hey, I did this. They're security people. They were born not to admit their mistakes and not to correct them most of the times. It has been very hard almost to maintain my sanity for the last week, but that's a good thing to say. I would say one, and that is the most unexpected outcome of this, is how much it discredited anti-American groups in Yemen. This has gone viral in Yemen, testimony, not just her. And there's always groups, whether politics or Qaeda, or anti-America. But the news exposed it so much in Yemen to the point it made them look, this is a country someone from us can say, and he would like us, and he can say to them in their Congress, you're doing something wrong. That was probably the most eye-blowing thing I have seen of this, is how much it delegitimized anti-American groups, which are very little in Yemen, just to be accurate. And at the same time, I think I mean, it's not something I did myself alone. Tens of people have said this before, but it was never given any attention. And we'll see how this goes up in a few months. I am missing to go visit my mom, but the roads are not safe yet. From something hovering over your head, literally over that. And we'll see how this ends up.
Any other questions?
I have a question. I was discussing with an armed services committee staffer about, my concern over, civilian deaths with the drone strikes. And his argument was, what about insufficient precautions in mission planning? That he's talking to pilots who maybe have been ordered to drop like a 1,000-pound bomb on a site where, homes and schools are close by. And if it was up to the pilot, he would choose to drop, a smaller bomb that wouldn't expand, or cause as much, civilian tragedy. So do you think that planning and assessing where strikes could help? Or, I mean, it's part of the for some people who are in support of drones.
Sure.
I mean, absolutely, that's part of what, all these operations are required to, and as a policy matter, the administration has asserted that they comply with the laws of war, and the laws of war require the acting state, the U.S., to engage in what's called a proportionality analysis, so that the United States needs to use more discriminating weapons when it can, and it would, your hypothetical appears, if the U.S. was using a large weapon that was going to take out a school when it had the capacity to use a much more precise weapon that would not take out a school, that appears to violate basic principles of the laws of war. So I would be very interested in knowing more about that.
Just a hypothetical.
If I may say to that, it's very superficial to say if drones are over and you bring ground forces, there will be no more civilians. I think, doesn't make sense. There will always be civilians, very unfortunately, in anything. But the difference is, when there is a battleground, I will flee my house. I will be expecting something like this. And when the drones happen, no, none of that. You're having a safe life. The issue is, there's a very fancy term they use here. I've heard the last few days in the media and in questions, collateral damage. I have seen this policy doing collateral damage to Al-Qaeda and main damage to civilians. And that's the main core thing with it, is the collateral damage is not to civilians, but to Al-Qaeda. There is another beautiful term, blowbacks. You say blowback when something is working and then it has some consequences, like any medicine. No, this has not been working to have a blowback. That's even misleading more when you say blowback, as if it had worked actually. And that has not been true in the ground. I have seen where whole world media reports about something saying, few militants were killed, 5. And I have seen that on the ground. I have visited these people and I have met with civilians who were actually the 5 militants. Reuters can put them militants, CNN can put them militants, Fox News, lovely. But that doesn't make them militants if they're not. And that's the core issue with this thing, is there's so much misinformation about it. There is journalists who goes to the capital of Yemen, stay in their fancy compounds, they go to Sana'a and they write about Yemen. Never bother to get out of the town or the city and see what is actually there. I hate to say this, but your journalists, your security experts, and as well as your researchers have failed you big time in misinforming you about what is happening. And that ends up the whole picture in DC of Yemen. It's not a country that is not understood. It's a country that is highly misunderstood. And it's highly misunderstood by those who especially think they know it. And that's when you have the biggest problem.
You said that there was talks about actually passing power to the presidents to happening? Is it being truly considered? Do you think there's a chance that it might happen?
Well, so this is a proposal, there was a proposal that, that was put forward by four scholars working with the Hoover Institute that would essentially repeal the AUMF, but replace it with an authorization to use force that is modeled after the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation process, by which the executive branch designates certain organizations as foreign terrorist organizations pursuant to certain requirements. Their proposal was that a similar model be used for authorizations to use force, so that Congress would specify certain criteria, and then the executive would be the one that would determine which groups met that criteria, and they'd have a list. I mean, as I think most of us know about lists tend to grow, not shrink. It's very hard to take somebody off a list. It's much easier to put somebody on a list. It's a problem we have with Guantanamo. So to answer your question as to whether or not there's, I know that it's a proposal that has been circulated widely. I know that the authors of the report have had discussions with various offices on the Hill. Whether or not anybody's actually turned it into a piece of legislative language, I don't know. I'm hopeful that's not the case, but I think it's something to be aware of and to be thinking about and be prepared, in my view, with responses as to why that's not a good way forward.
My question goes to the point of whether you consider, and if anybody cares to add to it, is it that this long and huge bureaucracy system that's developing under that list is the precise point that's affecting drone policy? Like having so much people work with many aspects of it, it's affecting how are we applying our policy throughout the globe.
Right. So this proposal is not yet law. I mean, what the authority that the administration is currently relying on is the authorization to use military force, which, for the reasons that I was trying to state earlier, also has its own set of problems because of the lack of clarity and the potentially expansive interpretation of the authorization to use military force, which is why I'm suggesting or pushing proposals that would sunset the authorization and, if necessary, replace them with more specific group-specific authorizations designated, designed towards target at very specific threats after public discussion and after public debate. I mean, I think you're right. I think that what's essentially become a broader delegation, a broader authorization than at least the initial language suggests, does create the room for the administration to engage in strikes in Pakistan and Yemen in ways against groups and against individuals that don't neatly fit into the statutory language that was passed on September 14th, 2001.
If I can just pull the thread a little bit on that. We talk about the scope of the armed conflict and which groups are associated forces, and it tends to sound really abstract. The reality is that if you had a situation like what Farea was describing, where you knew that there was a person who you wanted to target and he was a combatant, and under the laws of war, you could target him because he was a combatant, but there's schools around there. The laws of war in some cases might permit you to go ahead and do that strike depending on the amount of collateral damage. The laws of war are permissive. There's restrictions there, and they're important restrictions, but they're also fundamentally permissive of using force, because the presumption is that if the laws of war apply, you are in a state of armed conflict. You can use force. It is normal. We don't want there to be a worldwide state of armed conflict. If there is a worldwide state of armed conflict, then you can always kill, you can kill people randomly. Civilians can be killed. If there was an armed conflict that extended into the United States, then, in the new Barclays Center, which I live right next to in Brooklyn, I mean, I could be killed if there was a terrorist inside Barclays Center because I live right next to it. That's what we mean when we talk about the expansiveness of the authorization for the use of military force. We want it to be limited because if you don't have an armed conflict that's worldwide, human rights law applies. And we talk about the law enforcement paradigm applying. Really what it means is you have to face an imminent threat and the use of force has to be the last resort. Legally, that's what it means. As a matter of policy, I think most people would agree that we don't want to be reaching for a gun every time there's a threat to the United States unless that is a truly imminent threat, because we don't want to cause a lot of these civilian casualties to occur, which the laws of war in some cases would permit.
If I can just say one more thing. I mean, I think often when this debate starts happening, those who talk about the law enforcement model get kind of parodied and say, and basically there's this attack that the law enforcement approach won't keep us safe. Now, I urge you and your bosses to push against that, because it's just not true. I mean, first of all, a lot of commentators will point to the fact that the law enforcement approach failed us prior to 9/11. Our law enforcement capacities have increased significantly since 9/11. And our law enforcement tools, for a variety of reasons, which I'm happy to talk about in greater detail, either personally or now, are incredibly expansive and sophisticated and have proven to be effective in numerous cases and numerous instances of dealing with terrorists in our borders and terrorists outside of the United States borders.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, Farea, I wonder how President Hadi's agreement to have the drone strikes in Yemen have affected his legitimacy, and what internal divisions there are within the government about it.
Sure. I'm going to talk about all of that today. I mean, if you look to President Hadi, he was not someone that was elected over another candidate. He already came to power in a deal that no one was consulted with. It was a 10% deal, about 10% of Yemen's problems that touches the elite of the center. And he was not with two candidates running for election. He was running with his shadow. And all of that already decreased his legitimacy. The deal, the election, and now it's decreased more because he looks by the end of the day as if he's reporting to Washington and not to the Yemeni citizens, Yemeni people. I mean, he looks like your more committed ambassador to Yemen, and as the US ambassador to Yemen. That's something he's not understandably, I think, thinking of or thoughtfully thinking of. One of the things that really raised people against Hadi in the past is because he looked like someone who cared more about what DC wants or thinks or see more than the Yemeni people. It has, I think, and that's my fear, like in the very long strategic term, is all political parties in power right now, including Hadi, have lost their huge public legitimacy. And what that means is it makes entities like Al-Qaeda more patriarchal and more national and in a stronger position. That's perhaps in a country that there is no national identity, one national identity yet. That's one of the most dangerous things can happen in the future. If Al-Qaeda looks like patriarchal than Hadi is, I do agree that, I do think and agree and see that it's a huge problem, what he's looking to and his public endorsement of the drones.
And is there open division among leaders of the government about this topic?
This is interesting. So in the past, opposition parties used to condemn every strike of drones the US does in Yemen. Now they're in power, no one is saying that. The Islamist Party, for example, the most powerful party in the country, used to condemn every strike of drones, which means it has the most members, hundreds of thousands. It raged its members against this policy. Now it can't even deal with its members. The members are so raged. The leadership is pragmatic, even inside one political party. The elites usually. So that's another issue. You know, I hear a lot, we are in agreement with your government about this policy. Well, one, that's not my government. That's the world government in my country. I didn't elect these people. They came in an offer deal that was supported by the United States. Two, you're thinking of Yemen as part of Sana'a. And that the ideality is opposite. Sana'a is part of Yemen. If these people, folks, elites in the capital, which I think very cheap politicians, if they get out of their capital and their compounds, they will look like a total Orientalists, have no idea what they're talking about or no idea what it is looks like outside the capital. Therefore, when you make a deal with them, regardless how greatly they are happy with it, that doesn't mean I agree to that in my village. This parliament is expired in 2008. Corrupt deal supported by the world, including the United States, extended their stay in Nepal. And this government, I didn't bring in power. So yes, you had to deal with Sana'a, not with Yemen. And that's why it does not work outside the capital. And when it reached 30 minutes away from the capital, one of the drone strikes, and the person you could have captured also, people were raged about it, more than that. So, again, it's an elite deal that no one really submits to, or buys to, or will ever do.
Thanks, Farea. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you so much to you guys for coming. Thank you so much for the panel, Professor Gaskell, Professor Shaw, and Farea. I think they did a great job in just highlighting some of the issues surrounding the administration's drone program. And, you know, we're dependent on you to educate your boss, to kind of relay the message, specifically about, you know, the civilian risk of life, what Professor Shaw had emphasized in her